The information and opinions presented in this Arc Energy Ideas podcast are provided for informational purposes only and are subject to the disclaimer link in the show notes.
This is the Arc Energy Ideas podcast with Peter Tertzakian and Jackie Forrest, exploring trends that influence the energy business.
Welcome to the Arc Energy Ideas podcast. I'm Jackie Forrest.
And I'm Peter Tertzakian. Welcome back. So, Jackie, do you sleep with the drapes open or closed?
Closed. Has to be very dark. Yeah.
See, I'm just the opposite. I mean, I like to leave them open and wake up with the morning light.
Yeah, except in Canada, you're waking up at 4 in the morning in the summer.
Well, I just love that natural rhythm. And this time of year, it's getting lighter and lighter as we're definitively into spring. It's interesting, though, that you think about in the dark, you flip the light switch on in the morning, you're just sort of groggy getting out of bed, and you have no idea where your power comes from. You just sort of flick the switch and assume it comes on. So, power into your home is just one of those things that is taken for granted. And so what a better segue than to introduce our guest, who is going to talk about power, but not here in Western Canada. In Eastern Canada, we're going to be talking about the power markets in Atlantic Canada and the East Coast. And with us, we have John Dalton, who is president of Power Advisory LLC. And he's a senior electricity market analyst. And John, I think you're coming to us from Boston, Massachusetts?
I certainly am. Yes.
Welcome.
Well, John, you've had a long history of being in the power business. So maybe just introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us about Power Advisory, the firm, and what markets you cover.
Certainly, yeah. No, first of all, thank you both for this opportunity to kind of have this conversation. Look forward to it. So in terms of who I am, I typically frame myself as an electricity market analyst. I've got over 30 years of experience in the electricity sector, with over 25 years focusing on Atlantic Canada. And that really covers the full range of Eastern Canadian electricity markets. While I'm Boston-based, I had the good fortune of living in Canada and Toronto for 6 years, and in that time, really developed many of the relationships that I continue to maintain in Atlantic Canada. In terms of Power Advisory, we're a team of 22 professionals. We have the full range of disciplines that one would need to evaluate electric power markets, and as well as generation and transmission asset investments. And this includes economists, financial analysts, engineers, transmission planners, and contract specialists.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to talk about the East Coast of Canada, the East Coast of the United States, and it's an interesting power market that I think has lessons, much broader lessons, because between New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland and Labrador, and then the eastern seaboard of the United States, these are all very territorial type markets, each with their own power utilities and so on. And in the pursuit of net zero, pursuit of decarbonization of electrical grids, necessarily there's a need to go cross-border and so on. And we're going to get to that. I'm just sort of setting this up for our audience in terms of some of the places that we're headed with this thing. But let's just start with a characterization of the Eastern electricity markets. Give us the thumbnail about how those power markets and grids and consumption work.
One of the points that you made, Peter, is a good one, is that these are relatively modestly sized electricity markets. In total, if we're talking about the 4 Atlantic Canadian electricity markets, which would encompass Newfoundland and Labrador, PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, the total peak load for those electricity systems is about 7 gigawatts. And if you contrast that to Ontario, we're talking about 24 gigawatts for Ontario. And for Quebec, it would be in excess of 40 gigawatts. So these are modestly sized power markets. And as a result, cooperation is critical across the markets as well as transmission. So where you can develop generation and transmission in other markets cost effectively just within the market, I think in Atlantic Canada, you really need to cooperate.
Some people might think they're sleepy markets, but I think there's a lot of change afoot, a lot of it because of the government's goals to reach net zero by 2035. So could you just tell us a bit about the makeup of electricity? Like how much is dependent on fossil fuels?
Sure. Each of these markets really is kind of separate and distinct. One needs to kind of look at them separately. So starting first in terms of New Brunswick has the most diverse of the electricity generation markets, and they often claim to have among the most diverse markets, most diverse generation supplies in North America. So they have 36% nuclear. They have one nuclear unit there, which provides 36% of their supply. They have hydro, one very large hydro resource, which needs to be refurbished, which provides 28% of the total electricity supply. One coal-fired unit, which is scheduled to be retired by 2030, which provides about 16% of supply. A handful of wind resources that provide about 8% of supply. Biomass, a couple of independent power producer biomass projects that provide 5% of supply. A range of different natural gas generators that provide about 4%. And then there's one large oil-fired generating facility.
Well, I think it's interesting that New Brunswick has got the full gamut of almost every source, and even having been to the Bay of Fundy and seen their tidal station, so they even have, that's got to be like 0.1%. But it's interesting that New Brunswick has the full gamut of energy supply, but the other provinces, Quebec is dominantly 100% hydro almost, isn't it?
It is, yes. Hydro-Quebec is, virtually all hydro, as is essentially Newfoundland and Labrador right now with the commercial operation of Muskrat Falls.
Mm-hmm. And so it's really Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. There's a fair bit of coal there still. Is that correct?
Yes. Nova Scotia is predominantly coal. Well, coal is the largest resource in Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotia, interestingly, has a target to phase out all of its coal by 2030.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I've been to the Sydney coal mines too. So I'm an energy tourist. I've been to all these places.
What about Prince Edward Island? We can't forget about that.
I've
Where do they get
too.
their power from?
Yeah, where does Prince Edward Island?
So PEI, interestingly, gets much of their supply from onshore wind as well as from New Brunswick. They have a modest amount of on-island resources, but they have the highest penetration of wind generation of any province in Canada. So they have more wind generation than their peak load.
Well, I don't think a lot of Canadians would know that. I certainly didn't know that.
No.
That's really interesting. I don't actually think about, when I think about the Maritimes or Atlantic Canada, I don't think about wind and solar too much. Well, let's talk a little bit more in detail. Both Muskrat Falls and the Atlantic Loop are two very important projects that could really change the future of the region. Let's start with Muskrat Falls. Just to give some context, how big is the project? Where will the power go? And has it started producing yet?
Yes, so Muskrat Falls has been in commercial operation. It's a 824 megawatt hydroelectric facility. The power will be flowing from Labrador, where the project's located, to Newfoundland, and then from Newfoundland on to Nova Scotia and to other Atlantic and even potentially the U.S. Northeast. The challenge with the Muskrat Falls project has been the Labrador Island Link. The good news is that the Labrador Island Link has been recently operating at close to its rated capacity. So this project is very close to kind of final commercial operation. So that's good news for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador.
And just to clarify, that link, that's an underwater transmission line that would connect Labrador to Newfoundland. Is that right?
That's right. It's basically a 1,100-kilometer HVDC transmission line that connects the two parts of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador.
And then there's the piece that would go from Newfoundland to Nova Scotia. Is that also already ready to go?
Yes, that's the Maritime Link, and that has been operating for several years.
Okay, so that project is very close to being fully running. Now, one thing about that project, it was controversial because it cost a lot of money, and more than what it was initially budgeted to cost. Can you just give us an overview on what the final costs are and if there's a way to kind of put that in terms of levelized cost for electricity and how that would compare to other sources like wind or solar?
Sure. The bad news is that the Muskrat Falls project is essentially twice its total cost was about over $14 billion, and that's over twice the initial budget. I don't have an LCOE estimate for the project. It is higher than the cost of wind. I think, though, that when looking at an LCOE or levelized cost of energy, one needs to recognize that that really is just a cost metric. it doesn't really consider the value that the resource provides. And for a resource like Muskrat Falls, because it is dispatchable, it can provide the ability to operate when wind isn't available. And that's an important distinguishing effect associated with hydroelectric resources.
So in the pursuit of decarbonizing the electrical grid broadly, there has to be a lot of new infrastructure built. And like this cost overrun, I mean, I remember when Muskrat Falls started, I don't know how long ago, it was a dozen years ago, maybe longer. It was, as you said, $6-7 billion, and it ballooned to 11, and that was a big sticker shock, and now it's 14. What have we learned? I mean, Site C Dam is also probably in British Columbia is going to cost more. I mean, these estimates for building infrastructure always seem to be incredibly low. I mean, it's, there's that old joke, double this time to build and square the costs. Well, okay, we're not squaring the costs here, but it's doubling, maybe more. Have we learned anything from these sorts of overruns, and what does it portend for other infrastructure build-outs that utilities are building out over the North America?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Peter, what it speaks to is the real challenges associated with these long lead time projects. And as you said, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. When you're developing a cost estimate for these projects, you have to make estimates in terms of labor productivity. What are the underlying geotechnical conditions? What are the soil conditions? And in many instances, these are only estimates. And while one can perform studies to try to quantify the risk, what we've learned is that often these studies don't capture the full range of risk.
Now, as we go to more electrification, we're going to see growth in demand, and it has to be clean. And so hydro does have a great role to play in that. It could be available all the time. It could back up some of the wind and solar. But considering all the cost overruns, and probably we're going to see something on Site C that's the same in terms of being higher than expected, do you think that there are going to be other large hydro dam projects built in Canada, or like there are other ones coming up that you anticipate over the next 10 years will go forward?
Well, there's one project in Atlantic Canada that offers, considerable promise. It's the Gull Island project, and it's essentially 3 times the size of Muskrat Falls. So its capacity is in excess of 2,200 megawatts. And based on the site conditions, its cost is estimated to be well below that of Muskrat Falls. But it similarly represents a major challenge in terms of the construction timeframe. And in particular, one of the major challenges is because you need to finance that project, is lining up the contracts and providing the revenue certainty that you need to get financing under reasonable terms. And for a project of this size, you're going to need very likely multiple contracts with different parties. So that represents a specific commercial challenge.
Actually, guess what? I've been there too. I've driven through it. I mean, that is a really remote area. And I mean, it's not only building the hydro. Newfoundland and Labrador, it's called the Rock for a reason. I mean, the cost of building transmission lines must be prohibitive from there to anywhere where there's large population centers.
Yeah, it's all something that has to be considered when evaluating whether it makes sense to build the project. And, that's the cost of Muskrat Falls. Half the cost was effectively the cost of transmission.
Well, let's talk about the Atlantic Loop. Where would the power come from and where would it go to?
The most recent vision for the Atlantic Loop was expressed in kind of the recent federal budget. And it was framed in terms of transmission that would connect Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. So the idea here is that surplus hydroelectric energy in Quebec could be delivered to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But this would require reinforcement as well as the development of additional transmission to connect Quebec with New Brunswick and Nova Scotia.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this project has been a bit controversial in the Maritimes. There's some people that would view it as they would rather build their own generation and not be dependent on Quebec. And then the transmission costs could be quite large and they would have to pay for that. Is there support for it in the Maritimes, or is that still sort of uncertain?
Yeah, I think any of these large infrastructure projects are controversial. And certainly there are people who are much more interested in terms of developing domestic resources. And there are people who are very concerned with the environmental impact associated with siting new transmission infrastructure. So the project is not without controversy, but there are a number of supporters and advocates for it, and a number of parties who feel that additional transmission is needed to really better interconnect these provinces and really be able to allow them to achieve their net zero ambitions.
You mentioned the budget. The budget actually talked about 15% investment tax credit for transmission and potentially $10 billion in financing from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. It seemed from the label that it might be supporting transmission, although that wasn't totally certain how that would look. But do you think that would cause projects like Atlantic Loop or others to go forward? Like, is cost really the issue? You talked about some of the stakeholder issues. Like, I'm not sure if cost was the only reason these projects weren't moving forward.
Yeah, cost is one issue, and it's cost as well as financing. It's who's going to, at the end of the day, kind of be able to take these projects and be able to get financing under reasonable terms and conditions. And that's where the federal government can play an important role in terms of providing. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank can provide, loan guarantees and reduce financing risks. But yeah, there's a very real issue associated with securing stakeholder support, and that's always an issue for major transmission investment.
So we have stakeholder support, engineering, permitting, the capital to build these mega projects, then the government incentives. But then on top of that, there's what I alluded to earlier, which was sort of the interprovincial politics of it all and the utilities. I mean, certainly Hydro-Quebec is effectively state-owned, as are many of the others. And there's all these interprovincial pricing politics in terms of long-term contracts and so on. Can you talk to us about the challenges of cross-provincial border building out of infrastructure and what's going on there?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And it's a difficult one because one of the fundamental questions is how are the costs of any of these major transmission infrastructure, how is it going to be shared among the provinces? And as well, some provinces, view themselves as benefactors. Obviously, if Quebec is going to be selling additional generation to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, it can see itself as a clear winner. If New Brunswick is going to be the home for transmission that is going to ultimately be used to serve Nova Scotia, then New Brunswick could view itself as conceivably someone who's paying the cost by having to site the transmission in their province.
Yeah, I mean, I know that Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec have sort of been at loggerheads about the price of the electricity. Where are we at today, would you say, in terms of overcoming these provincial political barriers?
Well, I think there's a lot more talking that's going on now than there has been in the past. I know that there are discussions among the three provinces that are considering the Atlantic Loop. We see Newfoundland and Labrador talking with Quebec about the renegotiation of the Churchill Falls contract. So these discussions are underway, and I think that it's essential that there be such discussions if we're going to be able to achieve some of the clean energy ambitions that all these provinces have.
Mm-hmm. But it's probably good for some of our listeners might not understand the history, but the Churchill Falls project is somewhat controversial because Newfoundland and Labrador agreed to give their power at a very low price, and Quebec has been a beneficiary of that for a long time, and that's enabled Quebec to provide low-cost electricity to their citizens and export it to other places. So I think there's been a lot of history there that has resulted in winners and losers and a lack of cooperation, potentially.
Very definitely. And the Churchill Falls contract, the pricing on that, the current contract price is 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour or $2 per megawatt hour.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So, so that's a contract that has the vast majority of those benefits have flowed to Quebec, and Newfoundland and Labrador appropriately feels aggrieved. And, I think that there's a need to kind of hopefully put that behind them and to figure out what can be done in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a long payback period.
So, John, the Atlantic Loop, we just talked about that. That's an in-Canada project, but there's also a lot of projects contemplated to move power from places like Quebec into the United States, as northeast states. But my understanding is there's been a lot of controversy on those. Just give us an update on that. And do you think some of those might actually happen?
Certainly, yeah. There are several projects that have been proposed. One where there's recently been some activity, which is good news for the project developers, and I think good news for New England, is the New England Clean Energy Connect project. And this is a transmission project that would deliver surplus hydroelectricity from Quebec to the New England electricity market. And that project terminates in Maine. And the challenge has been that Maine stakeholders are supporting the transmission facilities and are kind of realizing some of the environmental disruptions associated with that facility. But the ultimate market for that power is going to be the state of Massachusetts. So the good news, though, is for this project is that there originally was a referendum that was passed where 60% of Maine voters voted to not support the project. The good news is that a few weeks ago, a court decision was issued which will allow that project to move forward. And that's good news for the region.
So we've got the base load dominantly coming from hydro. New Brunswick has got the nuclear reactor. But now New Brunswick is also, given their nuclear experience and history, pushing into small modular reactors, which is also potentially a large source of base load, which creates an interesting dynamic let's call it green on green competition, or no emission on no emission competition. And how does that all play out in terms of the market share of joules of energy or megawatt hours of energy that are delivered to the whole loop?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think that these small modular reactors offer lots of promise, but as of yet, we don't have any commercial operating experience with the technology. We have in Ontario Power Generation is talking with GE and Hitachi and has a target date for 2029 for a 300 megawatt small modular reactor. And as you said, New Brunswick also has SMR ambitions. But the cost of these and the time frame for when they're going to be commercially available is unknown. So I think that really is a question that's still unfolding.
Is the federal government is given some incentives for that as well?
Yeah, in the budget, there was the investment tax credit. But as John says, right, money is one thing, but how long does it take to cite these and the regulatory approvals? And, I do hope they're going to contribute, but I agree. Like we think about our 2035 net zero electricity, our SMR is going to contribute in a big way to that because that isn't that far away, potentially considering where the technology's at today.
Yeah, no, I think as Peter suggested, right, it's a critical baseload resource and has an important role to play. But how big a role is it going to have in 2035? That's a question still to be answered.
Mm-hmm. So you build the loop, and that loops around the Atlantic and Maritime provinces, including as well Quebec. And then all this other potential generation comes in, whether it's SMR, potentially more wind and solar, and you have broad-based capacity and competition. Actually, talk about wind and solar. There's not that much out there in Atlantic Canada, is there? And is there, well, you said like 4% at the front end, something like that in New Brunswick. So is there the potential for more?
There certainly is. Atlantic Canada has a really favorable wind resource. We have Nova Scotia that last year just contracted for 350 megawatts. They have another procurement scheduled for another 350 megawatts by the end of this year. New Brunswick is looking at additional wind. Quebec has additional wind procurements anticipated. So I think that wind has an important role to play. And as you said, Peter, the Atlantic Loop and the development of transmission infrastructure will play an important role in terms of allowing this wind to be developed.
And in the U.S., they're talking a lot on the East Coast, near where you are, about offshore wind. Well, what's the situation in Canada? Like, why don't we talk about offshore wind? Aren't those going to be more efficient and generate more power?
Yeah, so the real driver for offshore wind in the U.S., where I'm located on the Atlantic coast, is just the difficulties associated with siting onshore wind in many jurisdictions. You don't have the same challenge in Atlantic Canada, But I think that at the end of the day, offshore wind is going to have an important role to play in Atlantic Canada. The capacity factors that you can get from offshore wind are in excess of 50%. So it's a very attractive resource.
Let's talk about Quebec. They are known for hydropower, you said, almost all hydropower. Not a lot of wind and solar today. Maybe you can tell me how much they have. But do you anticipate there's going to be a lot of growth in Quebec on those types of resources?
Definitely, in particular wind. So I think that Hydro-Quebec has in excess of 4,000 megawatts of wind today. They've procured another 850 megawatts just this year, and they've announced another procurement for another 1,500 megawatts. But that is a system, given their storage capability of their hydroelectric resources, is well suited for integrating large amounts of wind. And wind is the lowest cost domestic resource and virtually new domestic resource in all these markets. So I think that there's going to be considerable amounts of additional wind in Quebec.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, we've talked about, again, all of the potential challenges to getting things done, from politics to NIMBYism to where the capital is coming from. And the plan is, I don't know what word I want to use. Is it idealistic to think that we can have this loop built by 2035 and achieve net zero electricity for Atlantic Canada and Maritimes?
I don't think it's idealistic, but it's a major challenge. It's going to require, we talked about cooperation in terms of with utilities, with governments, and it's going to require lots of cooperation. It's going to require lots of investment. And I think it's going to also require probably technologies that we don't have available to us today. Mm-hmm. One of those critical technologies is probably going to be something like carbon capture. We have carbon capture, but we don't have carbon capture that's at a cost that really makes it economically feasible.
Right. What I imagine geological storage sites could be an issue in some of those areas as well for carbon capture.
For sure. They do have some, salt domes, which could allow for carbon capture, but it's one of the considerations for sure.
Hey, John, last question for me. We always talk about the costs of getting to net zero and the burden, and is it going to be affordable? But we never talk about the opportunity. If Atlantic Canada were to pull this off and be green electricity by 2035, wouldn't one of the benefits, in my view, be that a lot of companies might come to this region of the world because they could produce their products and call them green and have no emissions associated with them? Like, for example, green hydrogen, making aluminum and things that take a lot of power, data centers. Like, do you think that if you could achieve this, that there'd be a lot of economic benefits as well?
Certainly, and we're already seeing this. We're already seeing lots of parties that are looking at Atlantic Canada as a place to produce green hydrogen, for sure, green steel, green aluminum, based on the attractive renewable resources that this region offers. I expect that you are going to be seeing people that are going to be siting there. We know that there are existing industrial customers that are very interested in terms of greening their operations. That's going to create, as you suggested, additional economic development opportunities for the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, I sense that there's a lot to learn from the experiences that are going to come out of this, notably also on the collaboration side, which seems to be a ubiquitous issue in building infrastructure for energy anywhere, really. It's technology, engineering, finance. These are not the major stumbling blocks. It's actually getting people to agree on how to do things. So we'll be watching it carefully. Well, John Dalton, president of Power Advisory LLC, thanks for joining us from Boston, Massachusetts, and shedding some light on the East Coast power markets.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.
And thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate us on the app that you listen to and tell someone else about us.
For more ideas and insights, visit arcenergyinstitute.com.